Karen Matthews had always believed that rules were suggestions, especially when they inconvenienced her. At 42, she had perfected the art of demanding to speak to managers, cutting in lines, and making her displeasure known to anyone within earshot. Her blonde hair was always styled in the signature bob that seemed to defy gravity, and her oversized sunglasses remained perched on her head even indoors, ready to be dramatically lowered when making a point. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Karen had planned what she called a cultural day with her teenage daughter Madison. The trip to Buckingham Palace was supposed to be educational, though Karen's real motivation was getting the perfect Instagram photos to make her friends back in suburban Ohio jealous. She had spent weeks researching the best angles and had even bought a new designer handbag specifically for the photos. The morning started poorly when their taxi driver took what Karen considered the wrong route to avoid traffic. She spent the entire 20-minute ride lecturing him about London geography, despite having visited the city only twice before. Madison slouched in the corner, earbuds firmly in place, pretending not to know her mother while scrolling through TikTok videos. When they finally arrived at Buckingham Palace, Karen's mood hadn't improved. The crowds were larger than expected, and she discovered that the areas she had scouted online for photos were now cordoned off due to ongoing renovations. The ornate gates she had planned to pose against were partially blocked by scaffolding, and construction workers in hard hats were moving about behind temporary barriers. Karen approached the nearest tourist information booth, where a weary-looking attendant was fielding questions from visitors in multiple languages. The young man, probably in his early 20s, wore the standard uniform and had the practiced smile of someone who dealt with difficult tourists daily. "Excuse me," Karen began, her voice already carrying that tone that made service workers everywhere internally groan. "I've traveled all the way from America, and these construction barriers are completely ruining my vacation photos. This is unacceptable. I demand you remove them immediately so I can take proper pictures." The attendant, whose name tag read James, maintained his professional composure. "I'm terribly sorry, madam, but the barriers are there for safety reasons. During the renovation work, the construction is scheduled by the royal household, and I'm not authorized to move any safety equipment." Karen's sunglasses came down and her eyes narrowed. "Do you know how much money I've spent to come here? I booked this trip months ago, and nowhere in your tourist materials does it mention that half the palace would be under construction. This is false advertising, and I want compensation." James patiently explained that construction schedules could change due to weather and other factors, and that information about ongoing work was available on the official website. He offered her a brochure with alternative viewing areas and suggested she might enjoy the nearby St. James's Park for photos. "Alternative viewing areas?" Karen's voice rose an octave. "I don't want alternatives. I want exactly what I paid for. I want those barriers moved, and I want them moved now. Where is your manager?" A small crowd of tourists had begun to notice the commotion. Some were taking discreet photos and videos, amused by the scene unfolding before them. Madison had removed one earbud and was looking around nervously, clearly embarrassed by her mother's behavior. James remained calm and professional, explaining that his supervisor was currently with another group, but would be available shortly. He offered to take down Karen's contact information for a formal complaint. This only served to escalate Karen's anger further. "I don't want to file a complaint later. I want this fixed right now, this minute. I have a schedule to keep, and people are ruining my entire day. Do you understand the concept of customer service? Because clearly no one here does." The situation attracted the attention of a uniformed police officer who was patrolling the area. P.C. Williams had been working the tourist beat around the royal residences for over 5 years and had seen every type of visitor complaint imaginable. He approached the information booth with the measured pace of someone who had dealt with hundreds of similar situations. "Is everything all right here?" P.C. Williams asked, directing his question to James while keeping a watchful eye on Karen. Karen immediately turned her attention to the police officer, seeing him as a potential ally who might have more authority to solve her problem. "Officer, thank God someone with actual authority is here. These people are refusing to accommodate paying tourists. I've spent thousands of dollars to visit your country, And this is the treatment I receive? PC. Williams listened politely as Karen repeated her complaints about the construction barriers, the inadequate customer service, and her ruined vacation photos. He nodded at appropriate moments and made sympathetic sounds, but ultimately delivered the same message that James had been trying to convey. I understand your frustration, madam, but the construction barriers are mandated by health and safety regulations. They cannot be moved by tourist information staff or even by police officers. The work is being conducted under direct orders from the Royal Household's Maintenance Department. This explanation did nothing to satisfy Karen. If anything, it seemed to fuel her anger further. She began pacing back and forth in front of the information booth, gesticulating wildly as she spoke about her rights as a tourist, the money she had spent, and the incompetence of everyone she had encountered. Madison finally approached her mother, tugging gently on her arm. "Mom, can we just go somewhere else? There are other cool places to take photos. Maybe we could go to that park the guy mentioned, or we could come back later when it's less crowded." Karen shook off her daughter's hand. "No, Madison, I'm not settling for somewhere else. I researched this specific spot. I planned this specific photo, and I'm not leaving until I get what I came for. These people need to understand that they can't just disappoint tourists and expect us to accept it." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and several people were now openly recording the scene with their phones. Karen seemed oblivious to the attention she was drawing. Or perhaps she welcomed it, thinking it would pressure the officials to give in to her demands. PC. Williams continued trying to de-escalate the situation, explaining various alternatives, and offering to escort Karen to other photo-worthy locations around the palace grounds. But Karen had moved beyond reason. In her mind, this had become a battle of wills, and she was determined to win. As the minutes ticked by, Karen's frustration morphed into something more dangerous. She had attracted a significant crowd now, with tourists from various countries watching the spectacle unfold. Some were taking photos and videos, others were shaking their heads in disapproval, and a few were making comments in languages Karen couldn't understand but whose tone she definitely didn't appreciate. "Are you people recording me?" Karen suddenly snapped, noticing the phones pointed in her direction. "This is harassment. I'm being harassed while trying to resolve a legitimate customer service issue. Officer, arrest these people for harassment and invasion of privacy." PC Williams gently explained that they were in a public space where photography was permitted, and that the tourists were not breaking any laws. This explanation only added fuel to Karen's fire. She felt cornered and misunderstood, convinced that everyone was conspiring against her perfectly reasonable request. Madison had retreated to a nearby bench, her face buried in her hands. She had experienced her mother's public meltdowns before, but never in a foreign country with this many witnesses. The teenager kept glancing around nervously, hoping none of her friends back home would somehow see the videos that were undoubtedly being uploaded to social media at that very moment. Karen's voice grew louder and more shrill. "This is discrimination against Americans. You're all treating me poorly because of my nationality. I want to speak to someone from the American embassy. I want to file a formal diplomatic complaint. This is an international incident. James." The information booth attendant had called for his supervisor, who arrived looking frazzled and slightly out of breath. Margaret Henderson had been managing tourist relations around the royal residences for 15 years, and she could spot a difficult situation from across the courtyard. She approached with the practiced calm of someone who had diffused countless similar situations. "Good afternoon, I'm Margaret Henderson, the Senior Tourist Services Coordinator. I understand there's been some confusion about our current construction activities. How can I help resolve this matter for you?" Karen immediately launched into her now familiar litany of complaints, but with Margaret, she added new elements about discrimination, poor treatment of international visitors, and threats to contact various authorities. Margaret listened patiently, nodding sympathetically and taking notes on a small pad. "I completely understand your disappointment," Margaret said once Karen had finished. "Construction delays and changes are unfortunate, and I can see how this has disrupted your planned visit. What I can offer you is a complimentary guided tour of the areas that are currently accessible. along with some exclusive viewing spots that aren't typically shown to the general public. We also have a professional photographer on staff who could take some lovely portraits of you and your daughter in these alternative locations. For a moment, it seemed like Karen might accept this generous offer. Margaret's approach was more accommodating than anything she had encountered so far, and the mention of exclusive areas and professional photography was appealing. But then Karen noticed that some of the onlookers were still recording, and her anger flared again. I don't want alternatives and consolation prizes. I want exactly what I came for, or I want full compensation for my ruined vacation. Those barriers need to be moved, period. I don't care about safety regulations or royal protocols. The customer is always right, and I'm the customer here. Margaret maintained her professional demeanor, but Karen could see the slight tightening around her eyes. I'm afraid moving the safety barriers simply isn't possible. They're in place to protect both workers and visitors. However, I'm authorized to offer you a full refund for any paid tours or activities you may have booked, plus complimentary tickets to several other royal properties. A refund doesn't fix my ruined vacation photos, Karen shot back. Do you know how long I've been planning this trip? Do you know how much I've spent on this outfit specifically for these photos? This is about more than money. This is about basic respect for customers and honoring commitments. The crowd continued to grow, and Karen's voice carried across the palace courtyard. Other tourists were giving the area a wide berth, not wanting to get caught up in the drama. A second police officer had arrived and was speaking quietly with P.C. Williams, clearly assessing whether the situation might escalate further. Madison finally stood up from the bench and approached the group. Mom, please, can we just take the free tour? It sounds really cool and we can take photos at those other places she mentioned. We're supposed to meet Dad for dinner tonight, and if we don't calm down, we're going to be late. Karen rounded on her daughter with surprising venom. Madison, go sit down and let the adults handle this. You don't understand what's happening here. They're trying to take advantage of us, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. When you're older, you'll understand why it's important to stand up for your rights. The teenager's face flushed with embarrassment and hurt. She had tried to help diffuse the situation, only to be publicly scolded by her mother in front of dozens of strangers. She returned to the bench, this time pulling out her phone to text her father about the situation. Margaret tried once more to find a solution. Perhaps we could arrange a special photo session early tomorrow morning, before the construction crews arrive. The lighting is actually quite beautiful at sunrise, and you'd have the area much more to yourselves. Karen's response was immediate and loud. I'm not changing my schedule to accommodate your poor planning. I'm not coming back tomorrow. I want this fixed today, right now, or I'm going to make sure everyone knows how terribly American tourists are treated here. She pulled out her own phone and began taking photos and videos of the construction barriers, the information booth, and the staff members who were trying to help her. I'm documenting everything, she announced loudly. This is all going on social media, and I'm sending it to every travel blog and review site I can find. You people have no idea who you're dealing with. P.C. Williams stepped closer, his patience beginning to wear thin. Madam, you're welcome to document your experience, but I need to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other visitors, and some of your language is becoming inappropriate. This was exactly the wrong thing to say to Karen. Being told to lower her voice was like waving a red flag at a bull. Her volume increased immediately. Inappropriate? Inappropriate? You know what's inappropriate? The way you people are treating paying customers. I have every right to express my displeasure, and I'll use whatever language I choose to use. The situation was clearly deteriorating, and Margaret exchanged glances with the police officers. They had tried every reasonable accommodation and de-escalation technique, but Karen seemed determined to turn this into a larger confrontation. Unknown to everyone present, including Karen herself, this was about to become much more complicated. Because while they had been dealing with an upset tourist at the information booth, they hadn't noticed the approach of someone whose presence would change everything about this situation. The crowd that had gathered around Karen's outburst suddenly began to shift and murmur among themselves. People started moving aside, creating a path through the group of onlookers. Karen, still focused on her heated argument with Margaret and the police officers, didn't notice the change in atmosphere around her. Through the crowd emerged a figure that immediately commanded respect and attention. Sergeant Major William Harrison of the Queen's Guard stood 6 feet 4 inches tall in his full ceremonial uniform. The iconic red tunic was immaculate, the brass buttons polished to mirror brightness, and the famous bearskin hat added another foot to his already impressive height. His black boots clicked with military precision against the pavement as he approached the disturbance. Sergeant Major Harrison had been conducting a routine inspection of the guard positions when he heard the commotion. With 30 years of military service behind him, including tours in Afghanistan and Northern Ireland, he had seen his share of difficult situations. But what bothered him most was not Karen's shouting. He had dealt with far worse. But the fact that her behavior was disrupting the solemn dignity that the royal residences were meant to maintain. The crowd fell silent as he approached. Even Karen stopped mid-sentence, taken aback by the imposing figure now standing before the group. For a moment she seemed uncertain, but then her combative instincts kicked in. Here was clearly someone with authority, someone who could actually solve her problem. "Finally," Karen announced loudly, "someone with some real authority around here. Sir, I demand that you remove these construction barriers immediately so I can take my vacation photos. These people," she gestured dismissively at Margaret and the others, "have been completely unhelpful and refusing to accommodate a paying tourist." Sergeant Major Harrison's expression remained completely neutral, a skill perfected through decades of standing guard while dealing with every conceivable type of public interaction. His voice, when he spoke, carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Madam, I am Sergeant Major Harrison of Her Majesty's Guard. The barriers you see are in place for the safety of all visitors and workers, as well as for the security of the royal residence. They cannot and will not be moved to accommodate photography requests." Karen's face began to redden. She had expected this impressive military figure to take her side, to override the decisions of what she saw as lower-level staff members. Instead, he was giving her the same answer she had been receiving all along. "I don't think you understand the situation," Karen said, her voice rising again. "I've spent thousands of dollars to visit your country. I'm a paying customer, and the customer is always right. I have certain rights as a tourist, and I'm being discriminated against because I'm American." The Sergeant Major's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture that those familiar with military bearing would recognize as the precursor to action. "Madam, your nationality has nothing to do with security protocols that apply equally to all visitors. The barriers remain in place." Karen stepped closer to the imposing guard, something that made several people in the crowd intake their breath sharply. Getting into the personal space of a Queen's Guard was not something most people would consider wise, but Karen was beyond rational thought. "Listen here, soldier boy," she said, poking her finger toward his chest, though not quite touching the red tunic. "I don't care about your protocols or your regulations. I want those barriers moved, and I want them moved now. If you can't do it, then get me someone who can." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The disrespect shown to the Queen's Guard was shocking to many of the observers, particularly the British tourists who understood the significance of the uniform and position. Madison had stood up from her bench and was slowly approaching, her face pale with embarrassment and growing alarm. Sergeant Major Harrison's voice remained steady, but there was now an unmistakable edge to it. "Madam, I strongly advise you to step back and reconsider your tone. You are addressing a representative of Her Majesty's Guard, and I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate respect." "Respect?" Karen's voice reached a new pitch. "You want respect? Then show me some respect by doing your job and helping a tourist instead of hiding behind your fancy costume and your bureaucratic nonsense. I don't care if you're the Queen's guard or the Queen's janitor. You're a public servant, and I'm a member of the public." The crowd was now completely silent except for Karen's voice echoing off the palace walls. Several people were recording the encounter, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. It was almost unheard of for someone to confront a Queen's Guard so aggressively, and everyone seemed to sense that this situation was approaching a critical point. Margaret tried to intervene once more. Perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting? I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone. No! Karen shouted, whirling around to face Margaret. I'm tired of your solutions and your alternatives and your private conversations. I want this handled right here, right now, in front of all these people who can witness how poorly tourists are treated in this country. She turned back to Sergeant Major Harrison, and her finger was now pointing directly at him. You and the funny hat are going to march over to those barriers and move them, or I'm going to file complaints with every authority I can think of. The American Embassy, the Better Business Bureau, TripAdvisor, Facebook, Instagram, and every travel blog on the internet. The Sergeant Major's response was delivered in the same calm, measured tone, but everyone present could sense the steel underneath. Madam, for the final time, I am directing you to step back, lower your voice, and conduct yourself in a manner appropriate to this location. The barriers will not be moved under any circumstances. Karen's response was to step even closer, close enough that she was now well within what anyone would consider the guard's personal space. Her voice dropped to a hiss that was somehow more menacing than her earlier shouting. Are you threatening me? Because I don't respond well to threats. I've dealt with bullies like you my whole life, and I know how to handle them. What happened next shocked everyone present, including Karen herself. Reaching into her oversized designer handbag, she pulled out a small canister of pepper spray, the kind marketed to tourists for personal protection while traveling. Without warning or hesitation, she aimed it directly at Sergeant Major Harrison's face. Maybe this will get your attention, she snarled, and pressed the trigger. The crowd erupted in screams and gasps as the pepper spray shot toward the imposing guard. But what happened next would leave Karen speechless and become a story that would be told and retold for years to come. The moment Karen pressed the trigger on the pepper spray canister, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching. The stream of liquid shot toward Sergeant Major Harrison's face, but what happened next defied every expectation of how such a situation should unfold. With movements so fluid they seemed almost choreographed, Sergeant Major Harrison executed what could only be described as a perfect military evasion maneuver. His head shifted slightly to the right, his body pivoted with practiced precision, and the pepper spray passed harmlessly by his face, missing him entirely. In the same motion, his gloved hand moved with lightning speed to catch Karen's wrist, not roughly, but with enough firmness to immediately stop any follow-up attack. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, but it was executed with such professional precision that it left the crowd momentarily stunned. Karen found herself looking up at the Sergeant Major's completely unaffected face, her pepper spray canister now pointing harmlessly at the ground, her wrist held in an unbreakable but surprisingly gentle grip. "Ma'am," Sergeant Major Harrison said, his voice still perfectly calm and controlled, "you are now under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard, carrying an offensive weapon in a restricted area, and breach of the peace. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right." The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause, gasps, and excited chatter. Phones were pointed in every direction as people tried to capture the aftermath of what they had just witnessed. Karen stood frozen, her mouth hanging open, completely unable to process what had just occurred. P.C. Williams and his colleague immediately moved in to assist, though it was clear that Sergeant Major Harrison had the situation completely under control. Within moments, Karen's hands were secured behind her back with plastic restraints, and the pepper spray canister was bagged as evidence. This can't be happening," Karen stammered, finally finding her voice. "I'm a tourist. I'm an American citizen. You can't arrest me for defending myself. He was threatening me. All of you saw it. He was being aggressive and threatening." Madison had pushed through the crowd and was now standing nearby, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, what did you do? Oh my God, what did you do?" The Sergeant Major turned slightly toward Madison, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Miss, your mother is going to be taken to the local police station for processing. You'll want to contact your father and possibly the American Embassy if you need assistance." Margaret quickly stepped in to help Madison. We'll make sure you get the support you need, dear. Do you have somewhere to go? Someone to call? As the reality of her situation began to sink in, Karen's demeanor shifted from shock to indignation. This is illegal detention. I was defending myself against an intimidating authority figure. I felt threatened and feared for my safety. Any reasonable person would have reacted the same way. Sergeant Major Harrison's response was delivered with the same unflappable calm he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. Ma'am, I approached this situation because you were disturbing the peace and showing disrespect to staff members trying to assist you. At no point did I make any threatening gestures or statements. I simply informed you of regulations and asked you to conduct yourself appropriately. That's not what happened, Karen protested loudly. You were intimidating me with your size and your uniform and your aggressive military attitude. I felt cornered and threatened. I have witnesses. She looked around at the crowd, expecting to see supportive faces, but instead found expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. Several people were shaking their heads, and she could hear murmured conversations in multiple languages that, while she couldn't understand the words, clearly conveyed disapproval of her actions. One elderly British gentleman in the crowd spoke, up loudly enough for everyone to hear. Absolute nonsense, love. We all saw exactly what happened. That guard was perfectly polite and professional, and you attacked him unprovoked. Disgraceful behavior, absolutely disgraceful. Similar sentiments echoed through the crowd in various languages, and Karen began to realize that her version of events was not going to find much support among the witnesses. The dozens of phone videos being recorded would tell a very different story than the one she was trying to construct. P.C. Williams began the formal arrest procedure, reading Karen her rights while she continued to protest her innocence and claim discrimination. Her voice was becoming increasingly shrill as the reality of legal consequences began to penetrate her earlier confidence. I want to speak to someone from the American Embassy immediately, she demanded. I want a lawyer. This is harassment and discrimination against an American tourist. I'm going to sue everyone involved in this travesty of justice. Sergeant Major Harrison handed the pepper spray canister to one of the police officers and stepped back slightly, his role in the immediate situation now complete. But before he could return to his duties, something unexpected happened that would make this encounter even more memorable. A woman in an elegant coat emerged from a group of what appeared to be official palace staff who had been watching the proceedings from a distance. She approached the sergeant major with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and when she spoke, her voice carried the refined accent of the upper echelons of British society. Sergeant Major Harrison, she said, I observed the entire incident from the palace steps. Your conduct was exemplary as always. However, I think there's something this young lady should know before she continues making threats about lawsuits and international incidents. Karen looked up from where she was still ranting about her rights and discrimination, suddenly interested in what this new person had to say. The woman's demeanor suggested she held significant authority, and Karen's instincts told her this might be someone who could help resolve her situation. Who are you? Karen demanded, her tone still aggressive despite her compromised position. Are you someone who can actually help me, or are you just another bureaucrat trying to cover up this injustice? The woman smiled slightly, but it wasn't a warm expression. I am Lady Catherine Pemberton, private secretary to Her Royal Highness. I have been authorized by the palace to inform you that your behavior today has been observed not only by tourists and staff, but by several members of the royal household who were conducting business in the area. Karen's eyes widened slightly. This was clearly someone with real authority, someone who might actually be able to influence the situation in her favor. Finally, someone with actual power. Lady Catherine, I demand that you intervene in this obvious miscarriage of justice. Your guard was threatening me, and I was simply defending myself as any reasonable person would do. Lady Catherine's smile grew even thinner. Miss Matthews, I'm afraid you misunderstand my purpose here. I'm not here to assist you. I'm here to inform you that in addition to the criminal charges you now face, the palace will be pursuing its own civil remedies for your assault on a member of the Queen's Guard and your disruption of official business. The color drained from Karen's face as the implications of this statement began to register. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of paying a fine or spending a night in jail. This was becoming something much more serious, with potentially far-reaching consequences that she was only beginning to comprehend. Lady Catherine continued speaking with the measured tone of someone delivering official communications, completely unfazed by Karen's growing panic. Furthermore, Miss Matthews, you should be aware that assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is not merely a common assault charge. Under the Protection of Royal Persons Act, it carries significantly more serious penalties, including potential imprisonment and permanent exclusion from all royal properties and events. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to process this information. The reality of her situation was becoming increasingly clear, and it was far worse than she had imagined. What had started as a simple complaint about construction barriers had escalated into a serious criminal matter with international implications. But I'm a tourist, Karen stammered. Her earlier bravado completely evaporated. I didn't know about any special laws. I was just frustrated and felt threatened. Surely there's some kind of exception for tourists who don't understand your laws. Sergeant Major Harrison, who had been standing silently at attention during Lady Catherine's announcement, now spoke with quiet authority. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, ma'am. Every visitor to royal properties receives information about appropriate conduct and prohibited items. Pepper spray is specifically listed as a prohibited weapon in all tourist materials. This was news to Karen, who had to admit to herself that she hadn't actually read any of the tourist information packets she had been given. She had been too focused on planning her photo opportunities to pay attention to rules and regulations that she assumed wouldn't apply to someone like her. Madison approached tentatively, her face streaked with tears and her voice shaking. Mom, Dad is flying over tonight. He's really angry and he's bringing a lawyer. But the lawyer says you might not be able to get bail until Monday because of the weekend and because it's such a serious charge. The mention of spending the weekend in jail seemed to break something in Karen. For the first time since the incident began, she appeared to genuinely grasp the severity of her situation. Her voice became smaller, less confrontational. Can't someone just explain to them that this was all a misunderstanding? I never meant to actually hurt anyone, I was just trying to get their attention. P.C. Williams, who had been completing his paperwork, looked up at Karen with something approaching sympathy. Ma'am, attempting to spray someone in the face with pepper spray isn't generally considered a way to get positive attention. Regardless of your intentions, you committed assault with a weapon on a member of the Queen's Guard in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple recording devices. As if summoned by his words, several tourists stepped forward with their phones, offering to provide their video evidence to the police. The footage, from multiple angles, clearly showed Karen's unprovoked attack and Sergeant Major Harrison's professional response. There would be no ambiguity about what had occurred or who was at fault. Lady Catherine consulted a document she had been carrying. Miss Matthews, I've been asked to inform you that your actions today will also result in your name being added to the royal properties exclusion list. This means you will be permanently banned from visiting any royal residence, including Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Holyrood Palace, and all associated properties. This ban extends to all royal events and ceremonies as well. Permanently? Karen's voice cracked. But what about my daughter's wedding? She's been planning to have her engagement photos taken at Windsor Castle next year. This will ruin everything. Madison looked confused. Mom, I'm 16. I don't even have a boyfriend. What are you talking about? The realization that Karen was now making up scenarios to try to gain sympathy was not lost on the assembled officials. Lady Catherine's expression remained unchanged as she continued her official notification. Additionally, Miss Matthews, the incident report will be shared with relevant authorities, including immigration services. This may impact any future visa applications or entry permissions to the United Kingdom. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle was slowly beginning to disperse, though many people continued taking photos and videos as Karen was prepared for transport to the police station. The tourists seemed to fall into two categories: those who were shocked and disapproving of Karen's behavior, and those who seemed to view the entire incident as entertainment. An elderly American couple approached Madison hesitantly. The woman spoke with a gentle Southern accent. "Honey, we couldn't help but overhear that your father is flying over tonight. If you need somewhere to stay or someone to sit with you until he arrives, we're staying at the hotel just down the road. We have grandchildren your age back home." Madison looked grateful for the kindness, especially coming from fellow Americans who weren't judging her based on her mother's behavior. "Thank you so much. I think the lady from the palace said she would help me figure out what to do, but it's really nice to know there are kind people here." Karen overheard this exchange and seemed to rally slightly. "See? Other Americans understand how poorly we've been treated. These people will be witnesses to the discrimination and harassment we've experienced." The elderly American man shook his head sadly. "Ma'am, we watched the whole thing from the beginning. That young man from the information booth was trying his best to help you. The police officers were polite and professional, and that guard never said or did anything threatening. You brought this situation on yourself." His wife nodded in agreement. "We've been visiting London for 20 years, and we've always been treated with nothing but courtesy and respect. The problem here isn't how Americans are treated. It's how you chose to behave." This final rebuke from her own countrymen seemed to deflate Karen completely. She had been operating under the assumption that she was fighting against foreign discrimination, but the reality was that her behavior had been so egregious that even fellow Americans were embarrassed by her actions. As the police prepared to transport Karen to the station, Sergeant Major Harrison approached Madison one final time. His imposing figure seemed less intimidating now as he spoke gently to the distressed teenager. "Miss, I want you to know that none of this reflects on you. You conducted yourself with dignity throughout this entire incident, and you should be proud of how you handled a very difficult situation. Your mother will have access to legal representation and consular services, so she'll be properly looked after." Madison nodded, wiping away fresh tears. "I'm so sorry about what she did. She's not usually this bad, but when she gets upset about something, she doesn't think clearly. Thank you for not being hurt, and thank you for being kind to me." The sergeant major's expression softened further. "You're very welcome, miss. Remember, you have nothing to apologize for. Sometimes the hardest thing about growing up is learning that the adults in our lives aren't always right, and that we can choose to be better than the examples we're sometimes given." As Karen was led away to the police vehicle, she made one final attempt to control the narrative. "This isn't over," she called out to anyone who would listen. "I have rights, and I'm going to expose this entire corrupt system. You'll all see. I'm going to make sure everyone knows how tourists are really treated in this country." But her words fell flat against the backdrop of dozens of witnesses who had seen exactly what had transpired. The videos already being uploaded to social media would tell the true story, and Karen's version of events would find little support in the court of public opinion. Margaret approached Madison with genuine concern. "Dear, we've arranged for you to stay at a nearby hotel tonight, and someone from the American Embassy will be arriving this evening to help coordinate with your father's arrival. You won't be alone, and we'll make sure you have everything you need." As the police car pulled away with Karen in the back seat, still protesting her innocence through the window, the crowd finally began to disperse completely. The construction barriers that had started this entire incident remained exactly where they had been all along, unchanged and unmoved by Karen's demands. Sergeant Major Harrison adjusted his uniform, checked his watch, and prepared to return to his regular duties. In 30 years of military service, he had faced down armed insurgents, hostile crowds, and dangerous situations that would terrify most people. But he would later reflect that few encounters had required quite the same level of professional composure as dealing with one angry American tourist armed with pepper spray and an oversized sense of entitlement. The incident would become legendary among the Queen's Guard, a story told and retold about the day someone actually tried to pepper spray a guardsman and lived to regret it. But for Sergeant Major Harrison, it was simply another day of serving with honor and protecting the dignity of the institution he represented. As Madison walked away with Margaret and the kind American couple, she couldn't help but look back one more time at the palace walls that had witnessed her mother's spectacular downfall. She made a quiet promise to herself that when she was old enough to travel on her own, she would return to London and visit these same places, but she would do so with respect, dignity, and an understanding that being a tourist was a privilege, not a right to make demands. 3 months later, Karen Matthews sat in her suburban Ohio living room, staring at her laptop screen with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The videos of her encounter with Sergeant Major Harrison had gone viral beyond her worst nightmares. What had started as a few tourist recordings had exploded across social media platforms, accumulating millions of views and spawning countless memes, reaction videos, and commentary pieces. The internet had not been kind to Karen. The hashtag Pepper Spray Karen had trended globally for weeks, and her face had become synonymous with entitled tourist behavior. Late-night talk show hosts had featured clips of the incident in their monologues, and her attempted attack on the Queen's Guard had been analyzed frame by frame by countless online commentators who praised the guardsman's professional response. While excoriating her behavior, her legal troubles had been resolved, though not in the way she had hoped. Despite hiring an expensive international lawyer, Karen had been convicted on all charges. The British court system had shown no sympathy for her claims of discrimination or self-defense. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing, remarks noting that Karen's behavior had been an embarrassment to international visitors everywhere, and that her complete lack of remorse during the trial demonstrated a fundamental failure to understand the gravity of her actions. She had received a 6-month suspended sentence, meaning she would avoid jail time as long as she committed no further offenses. However, she was also ordered to pay substantial fines, court costs, and compensation. More significantly, her permanent ban from all royal properties had been upheld, and her name had indeed been flagged in immigration databases, making future travel to the United Kingdom extremely difficult, if not impossible. The financial cost had been devastating. Between legal fees, fines, and the early termination of their London vacation, the incident had cost Karen's family over $50,000. Her husband Tom had been forced to take out a second mortgage on their house to cover the expenses, and their relationship had been severely strained by the entire ordeal. But the social cost had been even worse. Karen's employer, a large insurance company, had terminated her employment after the videos went viral, citing concerns about their corporate reputation and Karen's demonstrated inability to handle stressful situations appropriately. Her LinkedIn profile had been flooded with negative comments, making it nearly impossible to find new employment in her field. Madison, now 17, had transferred to a different high school after enduring months of teasing and harassment from classmates who had seen the videos. The teenager had struggled with depression and anxiety following the incident, requiring counseling to deal with the trauma of watching her mother's very public meltdown and the subsequent fallout. Karen picked up her phone and scrolled through the latest comments on one of the videos. They ranged from mockingly humorous to genuinely angry, but none showed any sympathy for her position. People from around the world had weighed in on the incident, and the consensus was overwhelmingly negative. Update on Pepper Spray Karen. Read one recent YouTube video title that had garnered over 2 million views. The content creator had done a deep dive into the aftermath of the incident, including Karen's court appearance, her employment termination, and interviews with other tourists who had been present that day. The video painted a picture of someone who had learned nothing from the experience and continued to blame everyone but herself for the consequences of her actions. Tom entered the living room, looking older and more tired than he had just a few months earlier. The stress of dealing with the legal issues, financial problems, and constant media attention had taken its toll on him as well. "Karen, you need to stop looking at those videos," he said wearily. "It's not healthy, and it's not helping anything. We need to focus on moving forward and rebuilding our lives." Karen looked up at her husband with eyes that still held traces of the defiance that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. "I just don't understand why people can't see my side of the story. I was a tourist who felt threatened and acted in self-defense. Why is that so hard for people to understand?" Tom sat down heavily in his chair, a conversation they had had countless times before. "Karen, I've watched those videos probably 100 times. I was hoping I would see something different, some angle that would support your version of events. But honey, there's no angle that makes what you did look justified. That guard never threatened you. He was professional and polite the entire time. But his presence was intimidating, Karen protested weakly. He was trying to intimidate me with his uniform and his size. Karen, he's a ceremonial guard at a royal palace. His job is to look impressive and maintain order. That's not the same thing as being threatening. And even if you felt intimidated, pepper spraying him wasn't a reasonable response. Madison appeared in the doorway, home from her new school. She had grown up considerably in the months since London, forced to mature quickly by the circumstances her mother had created. The bubbly teenager who had been excited about visiting Buckingham Palace had been replaced by a more serious young woman who carried the weight of public embarrassment and family dysfunction. There's another news story, Madison said quietly, holding up her phone. A British news channel did a follow-up piece about workplace harassment and how the videos of you have been used in corporate training sessions about appropriate professional behavior. Karen's face flushed with renewed anger. They're using me as a negative example? That's defamation. I should sue them. Madison and Tom exchanged glances, a look that had become common in their household. They had learned to recognize when Karen was spiraling into another episode of denial and blame shifting. Mom, Madison said with a patience that seemed beyond her years, you can't sue everyone who criticizes your behavior. The videos speak for themselves. You attacked a guard who was doing his job professionally. No amount of lawsuits or complaints is going to change what actually happened. The truth was that Karen's story had become a cautionary tale far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Business schools were using the incident as a case study in crisis management and reputation damage. Customer service training programs featured the videos as examples of how not to handle difficult situations. Travel companies included the incident in orientation materials about respectful tourism and cultural sensitivity. Sergeant Major Harrison, meanwhile, had become something of a folk hero. His calm, professional response to an unprovoked attack had earned praise from military leaders, law enforcement agencies, and the general public. He had been commended by his superiors and had received thousands of letters of support from people around the world who admired his restraint and professionalism. The Queen's Guard had issued a rare public statement praising Harrison's conduct and noting that his response exemplified the highest standards of military bearing and public service. Tourism officials had used the incident to highlight the professionalism and dedication of all the personnel who worked at royal properties, turning what could have been a public relations disaster into an opportunity to showcase excellence. Karen closed her laptop and stared out the window at her quiet suburban neighborhood. The American dream she had worked so hard to build, the nice house, the successful career, the respect of her community, had all crumbled because of 10 minutes of poor decision-making in a foreign country. But perhaps most tragically, Karen still didn't truly understand how her own actions had created this situation. In her mind, she remained the victim of an unjust system, discriminatory treatment, and a viral internet culture that had blown a simple misunderstanding out of proportion. The real lesson of Karen's encounter with the Queen's Guard wasn't just about the importance of respecting local laws and customs while traveling. It was about the dangers of approaching life with an inflated sense of entitlement, the belief that rules don't apply to certain people, and the refusal to accept responsibility for one's own actions. As Karen sat in her living room, surrounded by the ruins of her former life, the construction barriers at Buckingham Palace remained exactly where they had always been, protecting workers and visitors alike, unmoved by the demands of one angry tourist who thought she knew better than centuries of protocol and common sense. The comeback that had left Karen speechless wasn't delivered through words or dramatic gestures. It was delivered through the simple professional execution of duty by a man who understood that true strength comes not from the ability to intimidate or demand, but from the quiet confidence to do what's right, even when faced with unreasonable aggression. And that lesson, captured in millions of video views and shared across the globe, would outlive Karen's anger and serve as a reminder that respect, dignity, and professional conduct will always triumph over entitlement and aggression. No matter how loud the demands or how expensive the pepper spray,